If you've been following Edgar Cayce narratives, welcome back. If this is your first time here, this channel is about understanding the patterns in your life in a clear and practical way, without making things complicated or abstract. Today we are talking about a type of person you probably recognize immediately, and there is a strong chance this might be you. You are the one people rely on. You show up without being asked. You give your time, your attention, and your energy, and you do it naturally, without expecting much in return. From the outside, this looks like strength and kindness, and most people would say this is a good thing. But over time, something starts to change in a way that is hard to explain, and it doesn't go away even when you try to ignore it. You are the person people think of first when something goes wrong, because you are reliable, calm, and always willing to step in without hesitation. And over time, this becomes part of how others define you without even saying it out loud. When someone needs advice, they come to you. And when someone is overwhelmed, you are the one who listens patiently, gives your full attention, and makes sure they feel understood, even if it takes hours of your time and energy. In group situations, you naturally take on more than your share, because you notice what needs to be done and you don't wait for others to act. And this makes you the person who quietly holds everything together while others move on without thinking about it. At work, you are often the one who accepts extra responsibility, not because you are forced to, but because it feels easier to step in than to watch something fall apart or disappoint someone. And slowly this becomes something people expect from you. In your personal life, you rarely put yourself first, because there is always someone else who seems to need something more urgently. And saying no feels uncomfortable in a way that is hard to explain. So you keep saying yes, even when you are already tired. At the beginning, this feels right, because helping others gives you a sense of purpose and direction. And it reinforces the idea that you are someone who can be depended on, which feels stable and meaningful. But over time, something starts to shift in a quiet way, because even though nothing looks wrong from the outside, you begin to feel a kind of tiredness that rest does not fix, and it stays with you longer than it should. You start to notice that you are always the one giving, but not always the one receiving. And even though you don't expect anything in return, the imbalance becomes harder to ignore the longer it continues. And without realizing it at first, a simple pattern begins to form, where you are always available for others, but rarely available for yourself. And this is where things slowly begin to change. In your relationships, you are often the one who listens more than you speak, because people feel comfortable opening up to you, and you naturally give them space. But over time, you start to notice that the balance is not equal. And while you know many details about their lives, very few people truly understand what is happening in yours. When conversations happen, they tend to return to the other person's needs, their problems, and their emotions. And even when you try to share something about yourself, it either gets shortened, redirected, or quietly pushed aside. And you accept this without making it an issue, because it feels easier than asking for more attention. In close relationships, you take on the role of support without questioning it, and you become the stable one who absorbs stress, solves problems, and keeps things from falling apart. But this role slowly becomes fixed, and once it does, people stop noticing how much you are actually caring. At work, a similar pattern shows up, where you take responsibility not just for your own tasks, but for gaps that others leave behind, because you notice what is missing, and you step in automatically. And over time, this creates a situation where your workload increases while others stay the same. You may not complain about it, because you believe it is part of being dependable. But this also means people begin to rely on you in a way that is no longer optional. And what started as a choice turns into something expected, even when no one explicitly says it. When deadlines approach or problems appear, You are the one people look to for solutions. And even when you are already overloaded, you find yourself agreeing to take on more, because saying no feels more uncomfortable than the pressure of doing it. In your personal life, this pattern becomes even more subtle, because it is not just about actions, but about how you treat your own needs. And you often delay rest, postpone personal goals, and ignore signs of fatigue because something else always feels more urgent. You tell yourself that you will take care of yourself later, but later keeps moving further away. And what you actually do is continue to give your time and energy to others without creating space for yourself. Over time, a clear pattern forms across all areas of your life, where giving is not just something you do, but something that defines your role. And because of that, people begin to expect it without questioning it. As this continues, appreciation becomes less visible, not because people are ungrateful, but because what you do becomes normal to them. And when something becomes normal, it is no longer noticed in the same way. At the same time, your level of exhaustion increases, not suddenly, but gradually. And because it builds slowly, it is easy to ignore until it reaches a point where it starts affecting how you feel on a daily basis. And this is where the pattern becomes clear, because it is no longer about isolated situations, but about a repeated structure that keeps showing up in different forms, where you consistently give more than you receive, and you keep doing it even when it starts to cost you something important. At this point, the situation is no longer just about what you do, but about how it feels inside. Because even though your behavior has not changed much, your internal state begins to shift in a way that is harder to ignore. And the same actions that once felt natural now start to feel heavier. Giving still feels like the right thing to do, because it is part of who you are, and it aligns with how you see yourself. But at the same time, it begins to drain you in a way that is not temporary, and the energy you give does not seem to return to you in the same way. You start to feel tired even when nothing specific has gone wrong. And this tiredness is not just physical, because rest does not fully remove it. And even after time alone, the weight returns as soon as you step back into your usual role. There is also a quiet frustration that begins to build, but it is not always directed at others, because part of you understands that you are the one who keeps saying yes. And this creates a tension between what you feel and what you continue to do. At times, you may notice a small sense of resentment, not because you want to blame anyone, but because the imbalance has been present for so long. And even if people do not intend to take more than they give, the pattern still continues without interruption. The most difficult part is that stopping does not feel simple, because giving is not just an action, it is tied to your identity. And this creates a deeper question that is not easy to answer. If you stop being the one who always helps, always supports, and always gives, then who are you without that role, and what replaces it when it is gone? This question creates hesitation, because even though you feel the cost of continuing, the idea of changing feels uncertain, and uncertainty is often harder to face than exhaustion. You may also worry about how others will respond, because your role has been consistent for so long that people expect it without thinking, and any change might feel like a disruption to the balance they are used to. At the same time, there is a conflict between your need for space and your instinct to step in. And even when you decide to pull back slightly, you may find yourself returning to the same behavior without fully understanding why. This is where the tension becomes clear, because it is no longer just about external situations, but about an internal loop where you continue to give even when you recognize the cost, and stopping feels both necessary and uncomfortable at the same time. And as this continues, you begin to realize that the real issue is not just how much you give, but why it feels so difficult to do anything differently, even when part of you knows that something needs to change. At some point, the pattern becomes visible in a way that is harder to ignore, because it is no longer just a feeling, but something you begin to notice in real situations. And the same dynamic starts repeating so clearly that it stands out. You may notice that people come to you with the expectation that you will say yes, not because they are demanding, but because your past behavior has made it predictable. And what used to feel like a choice now feels like something already decided before you even respond. In conversations, you start to see how quickly your role is assumed, where others speak freely about their needs while you adjust yourself to fit what is required. And even when you hesitate, the moment passes and you find yourself stepping back into the same position. There are moments where you realize that appreciation is not as present as it once was. Not because people do not value you, but because what you give has become normal to them. And when something becomes normal, it no longer stands out or gets acknowledged in the same way. You may also notice that when you try to pull back, even slightly, it feels uncomfortable. Not only for others, but for you as well. Because the change creates a break in a pattern that has been stable for a long time. This is where a clear realization begins to form, because you start to see that your giving is no longer fully intentional, and instead, it has become automatic. Something you do without pausing to decide whether it is right for you in that moment. You begin to recognize that you are not just responding to situations, but repeating a pattern that runs on its own. And even when you are aware of it, stopping it is not as simple as making a different choice. There may be a specific moment that makes this clearer than before, such as agreeing to help when you are already exhausted, or realizing after a long day that you gave your energy to everyone else but left nothing for yourself. And this moment stays with you longer than usual. And in that moment, a simple but important thought appears, because you begin to question whether this pattern is truly about helping others, or whether it is something deeper that has been guiding your behavior for a long time without you fully seeing it. At this point, instead of asking how to fix the behavior directly, it can be useful to look at it from a different angle, not as a problem to eliminate, but as a pattern that may have a deeper origin. And this is where the perspective associated with Edgar Cayce becomes relevant. In Cayce's readings, patterns in a person's behavior are often described not as random habits, but as continuations of earlier imbalances, where something that was once out of alignment creates a tendency that carries forward and shapes how a person responds in the present. From this point of view, a pattern of overgiving is not simply about being kind or supportive, but may reflect a form of correction, where the person is moving strongly in the opposite direction of something that was previously out of balance. The idea is simple but important, because instead of seeing the behavior as a fixed personality trait, it is seen as a movement, something that is trying to adjust or compensate for something else, even if that original cause is not consciously remembered. In this context, Cayce's interpretation would suggest that there may have been a tendency in another period of experience where the focus was primarily on the self, where personal needs, control, or priorities came before the needs of others. And over time, this created an imbalance that was not resolved. Now, instead of repeating the same direction, the pattern shifts completely, and the person moves toward prioritizing others in a way that is much stronger than what would be considered balanced. And this shift feels natural because it aligns with an internal drive to correct something. This is where the pattern becomes more complex, because what looks like generosity on the surface may actually be part of a larger adjustment process. And the reason it feels so necessary is not just social conditioning, but something deeper that makes the behavior feel almost automatic. In this view, overgiving is not random, and it is not simply a habit that formed by chance, but part of a response that is trying to move away from a previous imbalance. And because of that, it can become strong enough to define a person's identity over time. This also explains why the behavior is difficult to change, because stopping it is not just about setting boundaries. It can feel like going against something internally important, as if reducing the behavior might mean losing alignment or returning to something that feels wrong. As a result, the person may continue to give even when they recognize the cost, because the pattern is not just about the present situation, but about maintaining a direction that feels necessary, even if it is not fully understood. However, the key idea in this perspective is not that the current behavior should continue without question, but that balance is not created by moving to the opposite extreme, and correcting an imbalance does not mean replacing it with another one. If someone once leaned too far toward prioritizing themselves, and now leans too far toward prioritizing others, both directions represent imbalance, even though they appear very different on the surface. From this point of view, the goal is not to stop giving, but to understand the pattern clearly enough to bring it back toward a middle point, where giving and receiving can exist together without one dominating the other. And this creates a different kind of question, because instead of asking how to give less or how to protect your energy, the question becomes whether your current way of giving is actually creating balance, or whether it is simply continuing a correction that has gone too far in the other direction. When you start to look at this pattern more closely, you begin to notice that it is not limited to one type of person or one specific situation, because the same structure appears across different lives, roles, and environments. Even when the details look completely different on the surface, you can see it in people who take on the role of caregiver, where they are always the ones supporting others emotionally or physically. And even when they are exhausted, they continue to show up because it feels like something they are supposed to do, not something they are choosing each time. It also appears in friendships, where one person consistently gives more attention, more effort, and more availability. And over time, the relationship settles into a dynamic where this imbalance feels normal, even though it quietly drains one side more than the other. In work environments, the same pattern shows up in people who become the dependable ones, the ones who fix problems, take responsibility, and fill in gaps without being asked. And while this often leads to trust and recognition at first, it can also lead to a situation where their effort is expected rather than acknowledged. You may also notice this pattern in people who struggle to rest, because even when they have time for themselves, they feel uncomfortable not doing something for others. And this creates a constant sense of activity where giving becomes the default state. What connects all of these situations is not the role itself, but the underlying structure, where giving is not just a response to a need, but a consistent way of functioning that continues regardless of context. This is why the pattern can be difficult to recognize at first, because each situation seems reasonable on its own, and there is always a clear reason for why the person is giving in that moment. But when you step back, the repetition becomes visible. Different people may express this in different ways, but the core remains the same, where there is a steady movement toward others and a gradual movement away from the self. And this happens over time without a clear point where it begins. This also explains why the pattern often goes unnoticed by others, because from the outside it looks like responsibility, kindness, or strength. And these are qualities that are generally valued, so there is little reason for anyone to question them. But from the inside, the experience is different, because the accumulation of small moments of giving without receiving creates a gradual shift, where the person becomes less connected to their own needs while becoming more available to everyone else. And when you see this pattern across many different people and situations, it becomes clear that this is not just about individual choices, but about a structure that can shape behavior in a consistent way, even when the circumstances change. From a psychological perspective, this pattern can be understood in ways that are more familiar and grounded, because modern psychology has clear frameworks that describe why people consistently prioritize others over themselves. And these explanations help make the pattern easier to recognize without needing to rely on abstract ideas. One common explanation is people-pleasing behavior, where a person learns over time that being helpful, agreeable, and supportive leads to acceptance, stability, or reduced conflict. And because this works in many situations, the behavior becomes reinforced and repeated automatically. Another related concept is the lack of clear boundaries, where a person has difficulty separating their own needs from the needs of others. And instead of deciding where to stop, they continue giving because there is no clear internal limit that signals when enough is enough. This can also connect to learned behavior from earlier life experiences, where being attentive to others may have been necessary for maintaining relationships, avoiding tension, or feeling valued. And because these patterns were effective at the time, they continue into later stages of life without being questioned. In many cases, the person is not consciously choosing to give more than they should, because the behavior operates at a deeper level, where it feels natural, expected, and even necessary. And this is why simply deciding to change it does not always work. However, there is an important detail that stands out when you look at this pattern closely, because while psychological explanations describe how the behavior forms and continues, they do not fully explain why it feels so difficult to stop even when the person clearly recognizes the cost. In many situations, people can adjust their behavior once they become aware of it. But in this case, awareness alone often does not create change, and the person may continue repeating the same pattern even after understanding it from a logical point of view. This is where the experience becomes different from a typical habit, because it does not feel optional in the same way, and instead of being something you can easily step away from, it feels like something you are supposed to continue, even when it becomes uncomfortable. The behavior can feel tied to a sense of identity, where being the one who gives is not just something you do, but something that defines who you are. And because of that, changing the behavior can feel like losing a part of yourself rather than simply adjusting an action. This creates a gap between understanding and action, where you can clearly see the pattern and recognize its impact, but still find yourself repeating it. And this gap is often where frustration builds because the solution seems obvious but does not feel accessible. So while psychology provides a clear structure for how this pattern develops, it also reveals a limitation, because knowing the reason does not always lead to change, especially when the behavior is deeply connected to identity, expectation, and a long history of reinforcement. And this is where the earlier perspective becomes useful again, because it offers a way to understand why the pattern feels necessary, not just how it formed. And when you combine both views, the pattern becomes clearer in a way that neither explanation can fully provide on its own. At this point, the focus shifts from understanding the pattern to seeing what it actually means. Because once you recognize that your behavior may be part of a larger movement rather than a simple choice, the question is no longer just how to change it, but how to bring it into balance. The key idea here is that balance is not created by moving from one extreme to another. And if someone once leaned too far toward prioritizing themselves and now leans too far toward prioritizing others, both directions represent imbalance, even though one may appear more acceptable on the surface. Giving by itself is not the problem, because supporting others, being present, and helping when needed are all valuable and necessary parts of human connection. But when giving becomes constant and one-sided, it stops being balanced and starts creating a different kind of imbalance. What often goes unnoticed is that receiving is not separate from giving, but part of the same system. And when one side is consistently missing, the system cannot function properly, no matter how positive the intention behind the giving may be. This means that if you continue to give without allowing space to receive, you're not maintaining balance, but reinforcing a pattern where your role is fixed in one direction. And over time, this reduces your ability to stay connected to yourself. Another important point is that overgiving does not necessarily lead to better outcomes for others, because when your energy is constantly depleted, the quality of what you give begins to change, even if you continue the behavior outwardly. You may still show up, still help, and still support others. But internally, you are operating with less clarity, less presence, and less energy. And this affects how you experience those interactions. Even if others do not immediately notice the difference, there is also a deeper consequence. Because when you consistently place others before yourself, you slowly move away from your own direction, and decisions become based more on what others need than on what is actually right for you. Over time, this can lead to a situation where you are active and involved in many areas of life, but still feel disconnected from your own path, because your energy has been directed outward for so long that it becomes difficult to identify what you actually want. The core insight here is simple, but not always easy to accept, because it requires a shift in how you see your role. And that is the understanding that giving is not meant to replace yourself, but to exist alongside a clear awareness of your own needs. You are not helping in a complete way if you remove yourself from the equation, because true balance includes both directions, where you can give without losing yourself and receive without feeling uncomfortable or undeserving. And this leads to a different kind of clarity, because instead of asking how to give less, the question becomes whether your way of giving allows you to remain present in your own life, or whether it slowly moves you further away from it. At this point, it is worth slowing down and looking at your own experience more directly, because patterns like this are not always obvious while you are inside them. And the clearest understanding often comes from asking simple but honest questions. Think about how often you find yourself in the position of giving more than you receive, not in one specific situation, but across different areas of your life. And whether this feels like a choice you are making each time or something that happens automatically without much thought, consider how comfortable you are with stepping back. Because if you imagine saying no, taking time for yourself, or not being available in the same way, notice what comes up for you, and whether that feels neutral or creates a sense of discomfort that is hard to explain. You may also want to look at how others respond when you are not in your usual role, because sometimes the reaction of others can reveal how fixed the pattern has become, and whether your presence has been understood as support or simply expected over time. Another question to consider is whether your giving still feels connected to a sense of meaning, or whether it has become something you continue out of habit, because there is a difference between choosing to give and feeling like you have to. And finally, there is a more direct question that brings everything together, because it moves beyond behavior and looks at the overall direction of your energy. And that question is whether your way of helping others is allowing you to stay connected to yourself or slowly moving you further away from it. If you always give more than you receive, then it may be worth asking not just how much you are giving, but what it is costing you over time, and whether that cost is something you are still willing to carry. If this video felt familiar to you in any way, take a moment to notice which part stayed with you the most, because that is usually where the pattern is most active in your own life, and recognizing it clearly is the first step toward changing how you relate to it. If you found this helpful, you can support the channel by liking the video, because it helps more people find content like this and keeps these conversations going in a meaningful way. If you want to explore more patterns like this in a clear and practical way, consider subscribing to Edgar Cayce Narratives, where each video focuses on one specific pattern and breaks it down so you can actually understand it and apply it to your own experience. And if you are still unsure about something, or if a part of this video raised a question for you, leave a comment and share what stood out, or let me know what topic you want to see next.